It's time for player season reviews. The Pacers season's been over for a little over a week, and now we can look back on what happened, who did what, who will do what next year, and all sorts of stuff, and who better to do it with. Continuing our series from last year than Caitlin Cooper of Basketball She Wrote. Today we're diving into the small forward/wings with season recaps for Aaron Nesmith, Jarace Walker, and Doug McDermott. It's all coming today on the Locked On Pacers podcast.
You are Locked On Pacers, your daily Indiana Pacers podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What up, y'all? Happy Friday. Congrats, you made it through the week, and welcome into another edition of the Locked On Pacers podcast, where we, of course, talk about the Indiana Pacers. As always, my name's Tony East. I cover the team for Forbes and SI, and today we're back on player season reviews. Caitlin Cooper from Basketball She Wrote and I doing what we did last year, looking back at every player season in depth, looking forward, what it all means for the Pacers. And today we start with some forwards. Aaron Nesmith, Jarace Walker, and Doug McDermott under the microscope, the same way we did it last year. One stat that was very relevant to their season, one over-under that either mattered last year or looking forward. And we go through some clips that you can't see, obviously, on this, but we describe them well, and you can see on Caitlin's Patreon. Basketball She Wrote is the way to find them and see them. They'll be uploaded somewhere as well, so you can see what we're talking about, what we describe them, and why they matter so much to the player season. We're going to do this for everybody on the team that finished the season with the Pacers, except for the two-way guys, Kendall Brown and James Johnson. Just not enough minutes there to really dive in. Today's the forwards. Also buy her merch. I have her Hot Girl Basketball shirt on right now. Highly recommend you all dive into. Let's talk some forwards. Looking back with Caitlin Cooper. It is June 7th, which is somehow the perfect time to start player season reviews for the Pacers because of their long run through the conference finals. And if you weren't around last year, it's going to be the same structure with different players. Caitlin Cooper from Basketball She Wrote is going to join me as we review every Pacers player season who finished the season with the team, except for Kendall Brown and James Johnson. They didn't play enough. And by doing so, we do it with one stat that says something about their season, one over-under that either says something about their season or their future, and one clip that we can't show you here, but will be on Caitlin's Patreon, Basketball She Wrote, for you to see afterwards. Caitlin, what are we going to do for our bit this year? We don't have popsicles. We don't have German to speak, although I didn't have any German to speak, and you threw me off with that last year. How are we going to handle that?
The A to small, which means every time. I think that the funny part of this is it would have been interesting to go back and look at what day we finished the player reviews last year versus what day we're starting them this year. And if we would have ever imagined that we'd be starting them this late this year.
Well, it was funny. Like, I'm going to do a show with Dustin Dopirak at some point about looking back at what we thought the biggest storylines would be about the season that just finished for the Pacers and how that actually came to fruition. And you and I, a lot of stuff we talked about is like, so it kind of felt like, yeah, they wanted to be better and compete, but like kind of a development year. And hey, they made the conference finals. And like, that was kind of reflective of their pressers at the end of the season, and will be reflected in a lot of stuff we talk about today. Cause we're talking about a vet that didn't play much, a young guy that played a lot, and a young guy that didn't play hardly at all. Small forwards today. And we're squeezing Jarace Walker in as a small forward. We're going to spend a lot of time on Pascal, Siakam, Obi Toppin, and the power forwards. Caitlin wanted to do Aaron Nesmith and Doug McDermott, and I have Jarace Walker. Caitlin, should we start with Aaron Nesmith today?
Can I just add on really quick that you saying we're going to squeeze Jarace Walker in it with the small forwards feels very...
I didn't even mean to do
that. And taking in a lot of meetings without necessarily...
I didn't actually mean to do that. You smiled when I said something, and I was like, what did I say that got that reaction? Let's start with Aaron Nesmith.
You're just that good at your job. Aaron Nesmith. Yeah. So I think we'll start with the one number first. And my one number is actually 360. And that is representative of the number of his 412 three-point attempts last year that he took without a dribble. So 87.4% of his overall three-point volume came without a dribble. And the reason why I think that that's important, and it goes right into what clips that I sent you and shared, is that during the playoffs, I think we can all tell that his catch and shoot rate fell off quite a bit from the regular season. So he was shooting 42.7% on catch and shoot threes during the regular season, which ranked 12th among the like roughly 60 players who attempted at least 4 per game. And the playoffs, that fell to 30.4%. And during that time, he saw more flyby closeouts and shot lower in terms of points per chance against full closeouts. So a lot of times in the playoffs, because certain players are getting extra attention, that can lead to more scrambling, which hence can lead to longer closeouts, can lead to flyby closeouts. And in those instances, I often felt like there was a need for Aaron to be able to leverage those longer closeouts with a shot fake and then take a lateral dribble. The one dribble threes have been on the rise for the NBA as a whole over the last several seasons in terms of being able to keep a three. So that's why I wanted to highlight that number right off the top.
So 2 things. 1, how much of that do you think baked into his career high 3-point percentage? And 2, do you think that that career high percentage led to the way he was defended and closed out on in the postseason?
I think that it probably did in part because they probably wanted him to do literally anything else besides being able to catch a clean catch and shoot 3. But I also think that a lot of it, especially in terms of the flyby closeouts increasing from 24.8% to 28.7%, goes back to what I said in terms of if there is, doubles going to Siakam or the defense is more tilted strong side towards Tyrese, that then makes for a longer closeout and people want to be able to run him off the line. And to his credit, something that did show up in the playoffs, especially if we go to Game 7 against New York when he went 8 of 8 from the field, is that he made a couple of pull-up 2s in that game. And that's something that he wanted to work on. It just didn't necessarily show up during the regular season. So during the regular season, I think he went 14 of 30 on pull-up 2s. During the playoffs, he made 10. So he almost made as many during the playoff run as he made during the entirety of the regular season. And there's certainly some value to that, of being able to take what the defense gives you, move toward the basket, especially with certain coverages they saw. There were times against New York, like if he saw the flyby closeout, he took a dribble, then, the next nearest defender was jump switching in front of him in terms of the ball. So he's not going to be able to get to the rim. So being able to hit the little pull-up 2 did matter. That being said, there were times where he had access along the 3-point line to, as I said, keep a 3, and he's just not as comfortable with recapturing his rhythm and being able to reload after that defender goes past him. Or there was instances like you'll see in the first clip of the package where he sees that longer closeout, I believe, from Precious Achiuwa, and he takes the one dribble and he's not going to look to shoot, and he's just automatically getting off the ball and reversing it to TJ McConnell because TJ's guys not playing him as closely. So I think what he can do, because so much of his value is tied into him being predominantly a spot up shooter, there needs to be a little bit more quote unquote self-creation, at least with one dribble, and being able to make himself a more lethal spot up shooter, if that makes sense.
It does. I have several reactions to the things you just said, so I'll try to go through them chronologically in my brain. 1, in that Game 7, it felt like every pull-up 2 he made was worth 8 points, because it was like the Knicks would score 4 or 6 in a row, and they'd run Nesmith off the line, and then he'd hit like the most important run-shattering shot of all time. He did it like 3 times in a row in that third quarter. Those were huge in that game as the Knicks cut it close. 2, I thought, I wonder how much we talked about his 3-point shooting last year. I'd have to go back and listen, because that made him such an obvious natural fit in any permutation of the starting 5 that they had this season, because he already was one of their better defenders, especially on the wing, despite not being, as tall as you'd want the best wing stopper on your team to be. And so being as close to a 3-and-D wing as you could call someone on this roster, made him a lock for big minutes every night. And I think the Pacers' hope, and a lot of the appeal, for those who remember, of Aaron Nesmith in that draft was like, this guy made how many threes his season at Vanderbilt? If he is actually this level of shooter on the catch every year, there's just such a prominent role for him on the Pacers every year. Thing 3 is, I'm actually working on a story on this. I talked to Aaron and Rick Carlisle about this during the season, but a big part of his growth in the areas you just described and what the clips show is the game kind of slowed down for him. And when he'd catch with space between him and the closing out defender, his reads on more than one dribble, but attacking all the way to the rim or getting the 3 up quickly, were way better. Especially late in the season, he had some impressive drives. He came back from injury in late February, early March. I'd be curious about his drive numbers off of closeouts. But he got a lot better at that stuff. And he just talked about how, we talk about, and people say this all the time for young players, just generically, the game slowing down. But for him, it was, he could read way faster. If a closeout came too hard, where the space was for either him to attack or getting into the teeth and then where the pass would go. And that wasn't something he ever really did before. And so I think that was a big evolution of his game. But now your point is accurate that what the in-between of those two things, of shooting and just going and attacking, is the next stage of What can you do with one dribble to either side or one dribble forward or a quick pass? That is the next step for him, despite making progress in those areas already.
Exactly, because if you look at the playoffs, 14 of his 70 field goal attempts in spot-up situations were at the basket. So that's roughly like 20%. His drive rate didn't really change, despite the fact that he was being guarded more closely and was shooting 24.1% on guarded catch-and-shoot threes. So his drives per 100 possessions during the regular season was 7.5. During the playoffs, it was 8. So
wow.
In both cases, he was scoring over a point per chance, or the Pacers were scoring over a point per chance on possessions when he was a driver. But it just becomes, what else can he do? And this is in part, too, I'd be interested to get your thoughts on this. When the Bucks won Game 5, after halftime, they came out and put Brook Lopez onto Aaron Nesmith.
Mm-hmm.
And then they switched everything else. And I thought, that really kind of threw the Pacers offense for a loop, because Pascal has things that he can do against a cross match. We saw him do this against Brook. We saw him do this against Al Horford. Aaron is more limited in terms of what he can do as a screener and his ability to keep a live dribble in the middle of the floor. And then the Celtics did that for one possession before halftime of Game 1, where Al Horford basically begged off of Pascal and told Jaylen Brown, like, you go up here and take this. I'm going to go take Aaron. Nobody else ever did that. And then when Game 6 came, the Bucks did it for like a couple possessions. Aaron did make 1 3, and then they didn't go to it anymore. I was very surprised that if they wanted, for the teams that wanted to be able to switch ball screens and put their big on somebody else, why they kept doing it onto Pascal rather than Aaron, especially given that Aaron wasn't shooting the ball to the level that he was during the regular season.
Yeah, I remember because that was a huge problem for the Pacers in that Game 5. Like, they were not ready for that group in the Bucks series and how much it switched. So I think the reason it's hard to perfectly align Game 5 and 6 is Dame's inclusion into that defensive group, because it switched up a lot of the stuff. Like, I asked Aaron before the game, hey, if Brook's on you again for stretches, like, what do you do differently? Like, how can you impact the game? And he smiled at me and he said, you'll see. So that I didn't get a lot from that, but I appreciated that. Nice.
Because the smart part of it from Doc Rivers was that they waited until after halftime to do it, because the Pacers coaching staff didn't have an opportunity to be like. I think there was like a couple, possessions, but they didn't go to it full time until after halftime. Yes. So it's not like the Pacers had a bunch of time to be like, hey, these are wrinkles that we can use to shift Brook out of the paint with you. It was more so like, we're just going to have to hope that Aaron makes shots. In Game 6, they did use him as a ghost screener a couple times to try to get Brook in space. But
the very first possession, they had him set that was his 3, right? He set a ghost screen, he caught it at the right slot, and he drilled the 3. And I was like, oh, that's what they're going to do. They're going to make Brook run around and try to get Aaron some open threes. And they didn't do a lot more of that after that.
Yeah, because, I literally think it was like 5 total possessions that Brook guarded him. Like, they didn't stick with it. And I think that for the sake of being able to maintain the switching scheme, if I were an opposing team, I probably would have just lived with what I got from that, but they didn't. But I do think it's something to consider headed into next season based on those specific things. And then we could probably talk too about like how much maybe the 3-point percentage was also like, he was guarding top assignments for the majority of the year, but it's a little bit different when you're in the playoffs and you're doing it full time against Chris Middleton, Jalen Brunson, Jason Tatum. And like, we can probably talk too about the fact that like Jalen Brunson, like Aaron Nesmith wasn't the only player guarding Jalen Brunson. A big part of the reason why Aaron was able to press up and guard Jalen Brunson is because Pascal Siakam was not guarding Josh Hart, was not guarding Precious Achiuwa, and was not even sometimes guarding Alec Burks. So that was a piece of it. But the fact that he was carrying that much of a load, we know that he's willing to put everything on the line defensively. He needs to be able to put more on the line, especially the 3-point line offensively. I think that's kind of the next area of his development, I feel.
Pick and pop, 6'5" Aaron Nesmith. Let's go. Every play. He needs, you know what Aaron Nesmith needs in his bag, Caitlin, is that screen Myles Turner used to do with Darren Collison, where he'd kind of set it backwards and then he'd just take one step back behind. Well, I guess with Darren Collison, it was a long 2, but Turner would set the screens backwards. Do you remember these? And then he would already be facing the basket. So when he popped, he would just scoot back into space. That's what Aaron Nesmith needs in his bag. Then he's already facing the rim. He can go fast if he catches. Yeah. Also, just as an inclusion, you mentioned this on Low Post, but no one talked about enough how much trapping Jalen Brunson made it harder to rebound in that series. And I think that is like a huge thing that got overlooked from that series. But anyway, yes, I agree with all that. And I think that it's funny that you mentioned transitioning that defensive effort to offense, because at times it felt like he was going a little too hard. Like, that is kind of a fitting thing that he can translate into his shooting and one dribble progression is like that amount of effort, not going balls to the wall to the rim, is enough sometimes, especially if you can make those shots.
And a part of the defense that I almost picked as the one number, but I didn't, is that just in total number of shooting fouls committed, which obviously is dependent upon your playing time and your games played, he ranks second in the entire NBA in shooting fouls committed during the regular season, 11th in shooting fouls committed per 100 possessions, but the rest of the players in the top 15 of that category were all centers other than him. But this is why it's interesting. In the playoffs, his shooting foul rate per 100 possessions actually went down. And that was in part why I was nervous for him to guard Jalen Brunson, because the game that he tried to do it at the beginning of February, he fouled out. And like literally the Pacers gave up over 50 points per 100 matchups with him guarding Brunson, which is worse than what Andrew Nembhard was giving up in the playoffs during that game. And then in the next game, they're like, we don't want Aaron guarding at the point of attack again. So they had Nembhard do it. But I feel like the playoff whistle actually benefited him to a degree. Like a lot of times, I mean, the Knicks themselves, like teams that play consistently with physicality, the whistle didn't blow as much. And like that almost helped him out in terms of what his strengths are as a defender in that particular matchup. So being able to watch how that was affected in the playoffs is certainly valuable, because it has been like the one stain on his defense, in addition to the fact that sometimes he just gets overtaxed with what he gets asked to do because they still don't have a wing size wing defender.
So one caveat and question before the over-under. The caveat is, duh, you want to foul less. Like, duh. Mm-hmm. Is it so bad if he's guarding the best players that he's fouling that much? Does that make sense?
I think it is depending upon the position. So like those two games when he was guarding Brunson against New York, and then the next game they played the Kings, and he fouled out against De'Aaron Fox again, it does give me some pause as to how their starting lineup is arranged and why it was important to put Andrew Nembhard back in the starting lineup. Because I would much prefer throughout the course of a regular season for Nembhard to be the player defending at the point of attack and for Aaron to be taking on other wing assignments, because I think that that's going to reduce somewhat of his foul rate, although I haven't broken down the numbers per assignment to see. That's just my assumption.
Come on. I'm going to name a random player, and I expect you to tell me how many times Nesmith fouled him this season, right?
I mean, I do know that in February he fouled Brunson 6 times in those 2 games.
My random player was going to be Jalen Brunson. Okay.
But my over-under, based on everything we just talked about, is 47.5. How many games will he start next season for the Indiana Pacers? He started 47 last year. And just like as a recap, while you're thinking about what your answer is going to be, is obviously, and I talked to you about this ahead of time, like you asked the question to Rick during training camp about like how players were going to earn playing time and how people were going to be into the starting lineup. And he had answered and said defense and unselfishness. And clearly Nembhard and Nesmith did not start the season in the starting lineup, but it felt very much like if those are the criterion and the qualifications, eventually they would work their way back into that. And I remember that when they played Cleveland the first time at the end of the game, they went back to the starting lineup from last year, with the exception of Bruce Brown was playing in place of Buddy Hield. And I wrote a story about on Aaron Nesmith and progressing backward, basically. And like, when would the familiarity and what they provide defensively end up being back what the Pacers relied on? And it was. So once Jalen Smith was starting at the 4, Aaron Nesmith was then starting at the 3 in what was a more natural position. And he stayed in the starting lineup the rest of the season. But given what we saw in the playoffs, do you anticipate that he will still start over 47 games next year for the Pacers? Let's just pretend he's healthy.
Yeah, I do. For 3 reasons, a couple of reasons. They're all kind of like linked. So one is their team situation more than anything. Like the most natural use of their resources is almost certainly basically running it back next year with like a minor tweak here or there. And if that's the case, I'd imagine their starting 5 to open the season is the same one that ended last season. 2 is I'll be curious with a training camp, a full season of familiarity, right? A big part of Aaron Nesmith's I don't know if improvement's the right word, but like defensive successes after the Siakam trade was he wasn't guarding guys who were way taller than him all the time. And if Siakam's on the team again, great.
Although, let me throw in there and say that in game 4 of an elimination game, Nembhard and Nesmith were guarding Tatum and Brown, not Pascal Siakam. Pascal was rarely guarding the top.
I kept saying on the show I thought Siakam should be guarding Tatum that whole series, and it never really came.
If he was going to guard Brown or Tatum, I would have leaned towards Tatum. But
me too. Anyway, assuming that it's the same largely top 11, 12, 13. Yeah, I would say over healthy. And like he just fits their team so well. And like I understand how, given the progression of this team, at some point, if they're going to really upgrade and have one of their starters go to the bench, yes, it would be Aaron Nesmith, right? Given who the other four are. But I think given their current resources and his own growth and improvement right now, that yes, it would be over 47.5 next year.
I think I would lean the over too. I think that there's a lot packed into this, that it probably shapes somewhat your opinion of where Bennedict Mathurin starts after returning from injury.
Yeah.
What's your opinion of what his situation and where his place in the rotation can be, along with what's plausible for them to make potential upgrades? Because I do think that after what I saw, I like Aaron a lot, and I think he was one of the best development stories this year for the Pacers. But I think that he could definitely be a swing piece in terms of what they need to upgrade as far both offensively and defensively, especially when his shot wasn't falling to the clip that it was. And because of certain matchups, there's still just going to be size that he gives up. That's no fault of his own. It's just that, like, you know, when you're watching him guard certain matchups, it still goes back to the phrase that I thought was most telling when they played the Orlando Magic and they were doubling Paolo Banchero in one game, and the color commentator said, you know, there's black shirts all around him. And the other person on the broadcast said, yeah, but they're all size small. Like, it still goes back to that to an extent. They're still in a place where they need a wing defender. So I don't know if that's going to come this particular offseason. And if the roster stays the same, I would anticipate that Aaron's the starter and will start more than 47 games next year. But I think in the back of my head that there's, like, to me, there's two swing spots in the starting lineup for me, and he's one of them.
One, the Magic's local broadcast team is freaking-tastic. Yeah. The real or fake is just sensational that they do also, or whatever it's called. Two, another wrinkle to this question could be how many games they play before the trade deadline. Not saying that Nesmith could be traded, but if they get an upgrade then that could be a time where that changes in
transition. Makes a switch, correct, yeah.
Hey guys, short little break here so we could talk about PrizePicks, America's #1 fantasy sports app with over 5 million members. And on PrizePicks, you can turn $10 into $1,000 in a single game, making your picks in just 60 seconds or less. Pick more than or less than on 2 to 6 player stat projections. You're locked in. They have promotions all the time, every single week. Lowering stat projections on Tuesdays, or getting your entry fees back on Fridays. It's America's #1 daily fantasy sports app with so many, over 5 million members, where you can get on the action with your friends and become part of the PrizePicks community. And it's the finals in the NHL and the NBA, which means there's even more on PrizePicks with the star players, where you get boosted payouts. And when the finals are over, the hoops action doesn't stop. WNBA, Angel Reese, Caitlin Clark, Breanna Stewart, where you can also win 100 times your cash there too. How you play, super simple. Pick a player and the more than or less than on their stat projection. Jaylen Brown, more than or less than 25 points. Jason Tatum, more than or less than 10 rebounds. Caitlin Clark, more than or less than 3.5 3-pointers made. It's that simple. Download the app today and use the code LOCKEDONNBA for a first deposit match up to $100. Again, that's PrizePicks with the app, and download it using the code LOCKEDONNBA for a first deposit match up to $100 at PrizePicks. Pick more, pick less. It's that easy. All right. Let's talk about Jarace Walker, Caitlin.
Let's talk about Jarace Walker.
Let's start with this. What a strange season. And I say that to say, I forget if you agreed with me or where we landed on this last year. I did a rotation projection for the Pacers this last season. I thought Jarace was going to start games for the Indiana Pacers. And even if he didn't, I thought him and Obi would be at close to the same minutes per game this last season, which again is reflective of what we said at the beginning. There was kind of this like development thought about this team that made the conference finals entering the season. And not only did Jarace Walker not get close to Obi Toppin's minutes per game, he played 10.3 minutes per game in 33 total games. And a lot of those were, not a lot, but half of those were garbage timey appearances. So not what I predicted would happen, even though I understand the decisions the Pacers made with his position entering the season. And boy, will we get to his minutes going forward, because if they run it back, going to be very intrigued by Jarace Walker's role next season. Where would you like to start, Caitlin? A stat, a clips, well, I'll have to describe, or the over-under? I think the clips is the best way to go, if you don't mind.
I was going to add on there and say that I do remember us talking about him after Summer League, and then I think we did another podcast right before the season started, if I remember. And I thought Obi was going to be in pole position. I thought that Ben and Obi would be the two starters going into last year. And I thought Jarace would certainly be in contention to be a backup 4. Then when preseason occurred, I wrote an article called Jarace Walker is going to be a microcosm of the Pacers, in that if they don't get off to the start that they're wanting and they veer toward development, I expected him to play. If they were winning, I did not think that he was going to play. And in that article, I talked about how Rick had said at Media Day and kind of talked about, like, if some of our young guys aren't getting minutes, we have the G League, and that's a great resource. And he complimented the Mad Ants coaching staff. And I was like, this feels telling. This feels where this is going. And then from what I had seen of Jarace in preseason, he didn't look ready to me. So I wrote in the article that I anticipated that he would play a number of games in the G League. And this article made a lot of people very angry with me and upset that, like, the lottery pick's not going to play in the G League. And as it turns out, several lottery picks from last year,
over half of them ended
up playing in the G League this year. So I still don't think that needs to be a negative for Jarace. And I do think that once he came back from the G League, there were games that he came back and played where I could tell noticeable differences and be like, that's a thing that he wasn't ready to do 2 months ago. And I think that the G League minutes did benefit him. But yes, let's start with the Clips.
Okay. Yeah. First of all, I agree with all that. When I heard the G League comments last training camp, I was like, oh, this is a Ben Shepherd thing, because I'm apparently just the naive, stupid person. Okay. The Clips are related to a stat that I'll throw in. Jarace Walker's turnover rate in general last season was fine, like 12, 13%. In transition, it was much higher. It was 19% in his transition plays. I'll describe them. You can find these clips in Caitlin's Patreon. But he gets a rebound versus the Bulls, and this is seared in my brain because that was an important tiebreaker game for the Pacers. He's running ahead in transition. He thinks Myles Turner's running. He thinks he has this pass. He throws a one-handed lob, tries to get it over the top. Terrible pass. It's stolen. There's a steal versus the Jazz. He sees Kendall Brown running ahead, but doesn't see the defenders. Throws a turnover. Gets a rebound versus the Suns. Running ahead, sees Obi Toppin. Tough pass. Tries to throw it over the top. Throws it too far out of bounds. Gets a steal versus the Hawks. Sees James Johnson behind the defense. Tries to fire it in too fast. Throws it right at a defender. It's stolen. And the last one's from a preseason game versus the Rockets. But running a great break with Jalen Smith. Throws a sweet little underhand pass to Sticks. Sticks throws it right back. He gets a defender in the air. He's got a corner shooter wide open on his left. An easy Sticks lob to his right. And he throws it behind Jalen Smith out of bounds. Like, very good, cool. The underhand pass was very cool. I even put cool in parentheses with an exclamation point in my notes for this play. He had a ton of time to throw that pass and threw it out of bounds. So the reason these are my Jarace Walker clips is because I still like Jarace Walker's feel for the game. I noticed this in the G League a lot. And funnily enough, this was both a negative and a positive. And Rick Carlisle brought it up. He said he was too jumpy on defense. He was too eager, right? He would go for steals he didn't need to. He would close out poorly. He would leap. And some of that is, when you're an amazing defensive player growing up in high school and even the college ranks, you get away with that stuff because a lot of times players don't fake or you get the steal and you can recover really easily. So like his instincts of recovering when he would make those plays were poor. But I bring that up to say his feel was good, but he gambled too much defensively. And that was part of the reason that they needed to develop him in the G League. I also think that same kind of thinking and logic applies to his offense, especially in transition. He sees the plays, but he's so eager and jumpy and like, I got to make the play, that if he just slowed down a little bit, he probably could have made all of these passes or all of these plays in transition. The Obi pass was easy. The James Johnson pass was easy. The Jalen Smith lob was really easy, but he got so antsy about throwing it and making the right play right away. It just led to a turnover. So he makes decent reads in these moments, and transition's a big thing for him to have with the Pacers. And he does it in the correct amount of time, but he doesn't slow down enough to execute them. And I think that's going to be an interesting part of his development is, can he continue to process and feel the game with these skills that the Pacers need him to have, while also slowing down in a way to make the correct decision in terms of when to gamble, when to jump, when to throw a pass, all sorts of that kind of stuff in his processing speed.
I think the interesting thing about Jarace is he is a utility player. He can do a lot of different things. And because of that, it's easy to envision him doing a lot of different things, in the sense that, like with the Mad Ants, when you're starting lineups that are Isaiah Wong, Ben Shepherd, Oscar Tshiebwe, Kendall Brown, Jarace Walker, more is going to be put on him to be doing the types of things that he's seen in this clip. Yep. Because there's not going to be a lot of bring up ball handlers. He is probably the best person to do wing initiation in those types of groups, to supplement for the fact that Isaiah Wong isn't necessarily a playmaker. That being said, I don't know exactly how that translates to the Pacers, given that Tyrese Haliburton is on record talking to JJ Redick on a podcast saying in comparison to Bruce Brown and Pascal Siakam, that one of the things he liked about Pascal Siakam in the first game that they played together is that Pascal readily gave him the outlet pass and understood that, like, I want to get the outlet pass right away. I want to get downhill, and I'm going to get the ball back to Pascal. And he got that in a way that, like, it took time with Bruce Brown. So the Pacers, in my opinion, might have the most depth of any team in the NBA at the point guard position. So then it becomes a little bit trickier as to, like, how important or necessarily essential is the skill that Jarace has at the next level. And that being said, like, there are times at the G League level where I've watched him do things as the bring up ball handler, and the only way to describe it is casually dominant. Like, I've literally seen him at 3/4 court pick up a live dribble and throw a one-handed dart cross court to the opposite corner to Ben Shepherd. Like, those are the types of things that he is capable of doing. But in these clips that you shared, what I find interesting is, like, right away, the one against Chicago, TJ McConnell's right in front of him. Like, there's the opportunity to just throw the easy advance pass rather than having TJ McConnell flank out and transition around the 3-point line. And it's like he has point guard privileges. And then, like you see, he's going from live dribble to pass and throwing that up over the top. A lot of times he wants to throw it to the rim runner, and he's kind of determined that that's what's going to be available and wants to use his soft touch to throw it over the top or lead the guy, even if those avenues aren't there. And like the last clip against Atlanta and the one against Phoenix, he could definitely make an easy advance pass to Andrew Nembhard to do exactly what Tyrese described. Give it to Nembhard, run the floor, get it back. But more of the times, he wants to be the person leading the break, and it sometimes seems like he plays with an extra pep in his step when he gets to have the ball in those situations, and he gets to trigger and lead fast breaks. And like the last one against Atlanta, like I don't know, this decision making's brutal, Tony. Like throwing the ball over the top to James Johnson as a rim runner when Ben Shepherd is filling the lane right beside you and
that pass
wide open.
That pass is bad.
To step into a three. And like some of it's like the pass type he's selecting isn't always the right type of pass, in addition to the pass location where he's choosing to throw it. So like, as you said, he had a total of 17 turnovers in 340 minutes, but 7 of them came in transition. And I think the Pacers as a whole, with him as the bring up ball handler, scored 0.804 points per chance with him doing that. But like, that just goes back to the whole thing that like Pascal Siakam right at the current moment has better decision-making skills as a bring up ball handler than Jarace. He may not have the same overall passing arsenal and different types of passes that Jarace is able to complete and make. But even Pascal doesn't have much leeway. Like, he doesn't do much as the bring up ball handler. I wrote an article about this when they played Brooklyn. Tyrese was getting face guarded a ton by Dennis Schroeder, and that was like the first game where from the tip, like Pascal was bringing the ball up. That doesn't happen a lot. Like, they don't really use Pascal in that way. So it's kind of interesting to watch Jarace. And like I said, he is a utility player. He can do a lot of different things, but it almost feels like his development is being tailored to the needs of both teams, be it the Mad Ants or the Pacers, more so than the spot on the team is being tailored to his development, if that makes sense.
It does. And I think that blend is because he's a utility player and they kind of feel like they can do both. And the reason I bring up this specific thing where he's both kind of making quick reads, but not correctly and not throwing the right passes, like, to me, if you're going to be a utility player on offense, right? And it's been made a big deal to me, not only in like the public conversations, but like private conversations with people who have watched him develop, is like, he can pass really well. People believe that he'll be an okay shooter in the pros. If he's going to be a utility player who could do all these things, the key part of it, and no matter who he's playing with, bench starters, whatever, is going to be making quick decisions, right? When he gets the ball, whether that's shoot, we kind of talked about this with Nesmith just now, but like shoot, dribble, pass, whatever it's going to be, he's got to do it quick. And so that's where I'm very interested in these. Is some of these, the read is really quick and the execution's really bad. And some of them, it takes him a second to get there, and then the execution's bad. So if he's going to be making quick decisions, he's got to make it right and make the right play. It was hard to find a not small sample size thing, by the way. You said 7 of his 17 turnovers, and I was like, dang, was it really that few that I sorted through clips of? So that's what it's going to take for him to play and be valuable for them offensively, because we'll see about his defense, but the size and speed he has at least makes a lot of people encouraged.
A lot of the times in the places where I like his processing speed a lot are when he's a connective passer.
Yes.
It's when he catches it around
and immediately gives it to someone else. Yes.
Right. That's where the touch passes really show up, and he can be connective tissue. He makes those types of reads very quickly. Like, even at the G League level, there was one time where there was a pass thrown to his shooting pocket that was pretty far off target. He knew that, and he automatically, it was just a quick touch pass to Ben Shepherd. Ben Shepherd gave it back to him. He made the three. Those are the types of things that you can readily see, like, yeah, that's going to plug in for the Pacers, especially if they need him to play at the 3 spot. But I like it a little bit better there than how much he was being used as a pick and roll ball handler for both teams. And some of that goes back to lineup construction. Like, it's probably going to be a trivia question that when they blew out the Knicks at home, that he was out there in groups that involved Isaiah Jackson, Jalen Smith, Kendall Brown, all at the same time. And he was basically running point. So
I appreciate you bringing up passing because that's my stat. I love when this all syncs together. I actually did some math. It was very easy math. I'm not giving myself any credit for this. The number for Jarace Walker is 1.16. You'll never guess what that is. Or maybe you can. That is his passes per minute played, which among Pacers players who actually like played more than I'm eliminating 2A guys and James Johnson. That's 5th on the team behind Tyrese Haliburton. And that is, by the way, 2 of these guys don't matter anymore, but that's behind Tyrese Haliburton, TJ McConnell, Buddy Hield, and Andrew Nembhard. He is at the guard level of that number, right? He's well above Bruce Brown, Ben Shepherd, Obi, all the forwards or finishers are closer to or below 1, and all the creators are like 1.2, 1.3, except for Ty and TJ, who throw a million. So all that to say, he does pass when he's in there. Like, he has good feel for those kind of things you talked about, and he does it at a fair level, which that is where I think initially, unless his shot is actually real, but I don't know that I buy it just yet. Where I think if he does play a lot next year, his impact will shine is passing and quick decisions like what we just described.
And the fact of the matter is to this point, it looks like he's going to need to play more so as a spot up wing. And when you go through and look at all the threes that he attempted at the G League level, which, I mean, to his credit, he shot 38% overall, over 40% on catch and shoot threes, over 40% on guarded threes at the G League level. That didn't carry over at the NBA, shot much lower on guarded threes at the NBA level. But like, that's positive progression from what I was seeing in college, especially because mechanically you can tell a difference because he was drifting to his left pretty much all the time at Houston and at Summer League, and in preseason also had the loose body removed from the elbow.
He worked really hard on his shot this year.
Yeah, and you can tell that there's progression there. Now, I would caution people and let them know that when you're looking at the spot up threes, I tracked it for motion. There is some times where he's relocating or he might shake up slightly from the corner or he's kind of stationary behind a flare screen. You're not going to see a lot of him like flying off a dribble handoff, coming off a stagger, doing anything out of the pick and pop, being a ghost screener. Those types of things like that the Pacers a lot of times use at the 3 spot aren't going to carry over in the way that we're talking about the other 2 players in this particular episode. But point being is he's being used a lot more so as a wing initiator and spot up shooter. And some of the passing stuff, like this is why I said, like you can envision him developing in so many different ways, but he hasn't necessarily gotten to show all of those things. And I don't know that he will get to because he was used in the short roll 3 times. He's a canny short roll passer. Like he has that in his arsenal. Never used a fake handoff. Wasn't being used as a handoff setter because he was very, very rarely in lineups where he was playing as a big. Like something I definitely wanted to see from him is, and I don't like player comps, but can he do some of the Draymond things, especially because if he were to get out there in minutes, more so with Tyrese than with TJ, those options are readily going to be available to him because of the way that Tyrese is guarded. So like that was stuff that I wanted to see. And it kind of feels like that's going to get left on the cutting room floor unless like there were games this year where they played the New Orleans Pelicans. They're in a massive hole. It's a blowout. Jarace gets minutes. The Pelicans are playing 2-3 zone. He's out there in lineups with Pascal and Jalen Smith and Andrew Nembhard. And the person flashing to the middle of the zone is Jalen Smith. Like it's in those minutes where like, you're not winning this game anyways. Like, can we just see Jarace make passes out of the middle of the floor as a big and see if that's like a way that you want to build out his game? Like that's the part that's a little bit, I guess I maybe disappointing is too harsh of a word, but I want there to be and maintain. I don't think that the Pacers have to know what he is right now. He's only 20 years old, but I hope that they keep a wide scope of what he could be.
Could be. Yeah. Okay. Hang on. Tangent time. Did you just use canny like as the opposite of uncanny?
Mm-hmm.
I've never heard that before.
Canny is a word, Tony.
Well, it's funny. So my dad and I had this discussion once because someone around us used the word discombobulated. And he's like, has anyone ever walked into a very clean setting and been like, wow, what a combobulated room? Like, you've only heard the opposite, right? So I've never heard canny before. That really threw me for a loop. Impressive. That could be our bit. We throw in a word that no one ever uses the opposite of. How about that?
It feels like it's probably like another nostalgic word. Like Moxie and cut of his jib.
What would be the opposite of Moxie? It has to be like Dis Moxie or something. That doesn't sound cool. I'm not going to do that.
Moxie.
All right. Well, unfortunately, to take a page from your playbook, my over-under for Jarace Walker is pretty similar to the one that you just offered for Aaron Nesmith. And that is 30.5. I went a little high for this, but I'll explain why. And that is games where Jarace Walker plays more than 10 minutes next season. What would you take?
I mean, as the roster is currently constructed, I would take the under. And this isn't an Obi Toppin episode of the show, but I guess I will let people know. I really like what Obi did. I think that he showed good development for the Pacers, and I think he definitely fits what they do. I think after watching that Boston Celtics series, it's easier to look down the road into the future and be like, things that they needed to do defensively, Jarace Walker doesn't face the same physical limitations that Obi Toppin does. I would have no problem if the Pacers want to retain Obi Toppin, but I would be evaluating other options at wing defenders, both externally and internally, before I made a quick decision there, meaning the Pacers are seeing way more of Jarace Walker than you and I are. They're seeing him every day at practice. They're going to see him at minicamp stuff before he presumably plays in Summer League. I want to see a little bit more of that. Depending upon what happens with Obi, I would smash the over if Obi isn't on the roster. Maybe that's me being a little bit too hopeful in that regard that Jarace will be able to crack into the rotation. If Obi is still on the roster, it gets a lot more tricky because then it's going to be a choice, I feel, between are you playing Ben Shepherd or are you playing Jarace Walker? And Ben Shepherd, while, I mean, they're almost opposites of each other, right? Like Ben Shepherd, we thought was being drafted as a dynamic shooter and he impressed with his defense. And Jarace Walker, we thought was being drafted because of his defensive breadth. Yeah. And he impressed because he made shooting progression in a lot of different areas. So I feel like it's probably going to be a choice between those two. And I would guess that Ben Shepherd would start out with that spot as his. Yeah. So if Obi's still on the roster, I sadly might take the under. But if Obi's not on the roster, I will gladly take the over.
Last year, the number was 15. So I just doubled it and said, what's the progression going to look like there? And I agree with you. It's Obi related. I think given what their team looks like right this second, any injury at 2, 3, or 4, they could shift things around and Jarace would naturally be the guy who comes in and plays next. Does that they were like, this is an under-discussed thing about the Pacers past year. Ty got hurt, which is a big deal, but they were pretty healthy in general last year. So if they had a longer season, if there is an injury 2 through 4, in theory, he'd be the guy, but is that going to be 30 games worth of 10 plus minutes? I'm not sure. And the things that would keep him on the floor, which is shooting, passing, or guarding, right? Can he be 35% from 3 in a bigger role? Can he pass in the way we've just described? Can he guard better, which he improved throughout the season, but that's what it would take. They have to be certain that it would happen to play him anyway. And you're right. It either comes down to Obi or deciding something on Shepherd or just in general how their offseason shakes out in maybe some unforeseen way. So,
and it's telling though, Tony, that when Chad spoke to this, he said, we were drafting Jarace as a backup 4. And now because of his shooting progression, we're thinking he might be capable of playing the 3. I don't want to put words in Chad's mouth, and I'm not intending to here. But that leads me to think that they think his surer path to minutes is going to be at the 3.
And you heard what he said about Obi 10 seconds later, which is we really like that guy. We'd like to have him back. He fits real well with us, right? So,
and another piece of context is I did want to look. I went and looked at I think it was 10 games that Doug McDermott missed with the calf injury. And Jarace averaged 12.2 minutes per game in those games. He did not play in 3 of them, but in the 7 that he played, he averaged 12 minutes. So he was seeing the floor when Doug wasn't an option.
What a transition. Is that intentional?
I mean,
I'm also
my first podcast, Tony.
To be clear, just given what I am thinking is going to happen with Obi and the team's current structure, I would take the under, but I think it'll be close actually to that 30 number of how many games of that minutes he played. Okay. Transition. Let's talk about Doug McDermott.
Doug McDermott. Fun fact. Did you know that he had the highest plus minus in the series against Boston?
Oh, we were cracking up in media row.
It was a 3-and-D stopper.
Came in and guarded Tatum very well for a big possession. All right.
Yep. And then a possession later, he got hunted by Tatum. Pascal Siakam was emergency help with the nail, and they got beat easily on a backside cut from Peyton Pritchard. Because, like, that's the thing. Like, yeah, I mean, sometimes Doug might be able to switch in those situations, and I give him credit. I think for the most part, he can feasibly play within team defensive schemes, but it requires shrinking space behind him and then what you give up potentially because of having to do that. So keeping in mind that he does get targeted quite often and isn't always a Tatum stopper or somebody who gets key putbacks on possessions. The point that I wanted to bring up, let's just go right to the number.
Right.
The number for me is 42.9, and that is the percentage of his plays off screens, possessions, in which he was moving to his left. And for context on
that's really high, right?
That's very high. So the last season that he played for the Indiana Pacers under head coach Nate Bjorkgren, that number was 19.8%. Wow. I'm sure people can think back and imagine that the majority of plays that Doug McDermott started for the Pacers in that season were with him in the left corner, either flying off of staggered screens or receiving a handoff with Domantas Sabonis, dribbling with his dominant left hand into the right corner to create space with contact for Doug to then fly off to his right or swing out off of those screens to his right. And potentially, like when they were running wheel, put the ball on the floor with his right hand and get to the rim more often as he was. And this speaks to the broader point because, yes, that was 19.8 with Sabonis. He and Sabonis fit each other very well because he was playing with a Fulcrum who is left-hand dominant. McDermott prefers to move to his right. They were the number one assist combination on the Pacers that season. This year, much could be said in the same case with Buddy Hield and Tyrese Haliburton. Tyrese Haliburton, as we know from the playoffs, a much more effective finisher with his right hand, prefers to drive right. Buddy Hield, unlike Doug McDermott, prefers to fly off of screens moving to his left. So if Tyrese is on the right side of the floor, if TJ McConnell's on the right side of the floor and TJ wants to Nash to his right, Buddy's very comfortable coming up out of the right corner and setting a screen and clearing space to the top of the floor. And sometimes he might even mix in a keeper himself. He can put the ball on the floor with his left and potentially get to his lefty reach out. Those are not things that Doug is going to do. So I can flow right into the clips that I sent you of Doug, where he's playing, like running up. This is something Doug would have run under both Nate McMillan and Nate Bjorkgren. Screen the screener out of floppy, only he's moving towards the right corner, which is the opposite direction that he would have ran it before with TJ McConnell as the ball handler. He then sets a go screen for TJ, catches it at the top of the key. There's nothing he's going to do with his left hand, even against Evan Fournier, to put the ball on the floor in that situation. This is against the Detroit Pistons. Then in the reverse of that, this possession against Golden State, you can see that TJ is adapted to Doug. Doug is coming up out of the left corner to screen and open up a gap for TJ. But unlike what TJ would do on the right side of the floor when he immediately attacks baseline and dribbles under the basket, he has to wait for a subsequent ball screen from Jalen Smith. And then a lot of times when TJ drives left, he's going to be looking to make either the pass under the basket or try to find the opposite corner rather than him immediately going to his own finishing package. Those same plays I'll have linked in the article that I'm going to post with that. Like watching the difference between what Doug and Buddy would do in those situations. Like I said, Buddy coming off of that floppy action might get it, fake the handoff back to TJ, and he's going to turn the ball downhill. Or it might become like a little bit of subsequent driving kick. I'm not trying to make it out that Buddy's like a top ball handler. We all saw him through the majority of his tenure. But even if you want to eliminate Buddy and be like the past is in the past, Ben Shepherd, going back to his time at Belmont, is also somebody who is far more comfortable going off of plays, off of screens to his left. So he fits that better, in addition to he's not going to have the same problems. He doesn't have enough length to contest Jason Tatum all the time, but he's also not going to be targeted by every single wing opponent in most games to the degree that Doug is. So I guess this boils down in this long soliloquy to me making the point that Doug's biggest strength, which is being a dynamic shooter, doesn't exactly bring out the strengths of his teammates, nor does that apply in the reverse. His teammates' strengths don't bring out Doug's strengths because all movement shooters are not created equal. Rick Carlisle runs a lot of sets with dynamic movement shooter actions in them, but I don't think that Doug cleanly plugs into them because of the directions that he and his teammates need to move most comfortably.
Are you suggesting they undo the Haliburton trade? Is that what you all?
Yes, in order to keep Doug and to make him a more lethal shooter.
Maybe I'm just, I am typically a crazy person. I remember the game at home after he came back from injury, they were playing the Nets, I think. And he had a play where he came up from the left corner and just like flicked it. That's how his threes always look. He just flicks in a three with his quick release. And you're like, that can't happen all the time. And that's part of why is because he came from the left side on that play. It's like, that's just not a thing. And they don't do as much handoff stuff with this team. So it's going to be harder to get him into those actions. And I never really got dug into Doug. I never really researched why his percentage never clicked with this team in the ways it did every season before this, because he was still well over 40% with the Spurs even this season. And I wonder how much just the style and direction of his threes was a part of it. And he would say like, yeah, I got to knock down more shots. And I'm sure he expects more from himself as a versatile shooter than he was with the Pacers. But, you know, if he's going to be a guy who, like, the second he comes in a playoff game, the Celtics like drop what they're doing and like, okay, who's he guarding? Let's figure this out. He's got to be able to make a good amount of threes. And if he just can't stylistically fit that way, then it's hard to have him play a lot or even a little in those settings.
Yeah, because I mean, it's somewhat the play types too. Like, Buddy's never been an effective player. Like, he's not going to swing out like Doug and shoot off a stagger. Typically, if he comes off a stagger, it's going to be to flip it right back to Tyrese and keep moving. Like, Buddy is more a transition three-point shooter and somebody who, like I said, as a ghost screener is going to move into open space. That actually fits better with how the Pacers play than Doug is somebody who shoots better coming off of screens and shoots better rising and firing up out of handoffs, which fit very well with what Nate Bjorkgren did and with what Domantas Sabonis did. But even to put that number into more context, the last time he attempted or more of his possessions frequency-wise came with him moving to his left as a shooter was the 2016-17 season when he was still with the Bulls, which was at 51.9%. Otherwise, that has always been below 40% for his career and dipped very low the last time when he was still playing with the Pacers. So I just think overall fit-wise, I completely understand why the Pacers wanted to add a movement shooter back, especially because I compare it to like a hurricane followed by a tsunami. The hurricane was Tyrese's hamstring injury and then re-injury, re-aggravation, whatever they want to call it, when he came back against Portland and then missed additional time. He wasn't capable of moving to the degree and creating separation on his own that he would have been before. Then they trade Buddy, and the person who was most responsible for helping him generate that separation with the ghost screens was no longer there. So he has like a 5-game stretch going up to that game in San Antonio where his ball handling picks dwindled very, very low. And he was being used more often as the movement shooter and out of floppy actions. And it's like, hey, these aren't the normal threes that he's used to getting. He's not moving quite right. And it was never a case of Buddy made Tyrese who Tyrese is, or Tyrese couldn't be a star without Buddy. That's not the point. It's just that within the offense and the fact that he was limited, they needed a movement shooter. So I understand why they went and pursued Doug if they weren't going to continue the relationship with Buddy, because they have Nembhard, they have Mathurin, they have Shepherd. But Doug, again, because of the reasons we just put out, isn't necessarily a great fit to complement the strengths of TJ and Tyrese. So it didn't exactly work out to that extent. And because Tyrese being a movement shooter ended up mattering in the playoffs, and Andrew being able to initiate offense definitely did end up mattering later on. So the hurricane versus, followed by the tsunami ended up having benefits in the long term. Yeah. But I understand why they tried to find a Band-Aid. They didn't have Flex Seal. It couldn't hold the leak.
Extremely low cost Band-Aid also, which made it, even if people were like, what's this guy going to do? Is he even going to play? Like, that makes sense to me. Why not? Right? Like, if you think you need a shooter and it costs a player you're not going to keep anyway and a crappy pick, great, do it. So I got it, even though I don't think it panned out the way the Pacers or Doug, given his 3-point percentage, even thought. And,
the one negative drawback of this is that there was kind of a choice between playing Doug or Jarace.
Yes.
And because they needed to have the movement shooter in some of those actions, it more so went to Doug, and those are minutes that Jarace didn't necessarily get. And I don't know how much further along Jarace would be in his development. But when you look in your crystal ball and you remember the last time that Doug McDermott played for the Pacers, and you're like, oh yeah, he went 2 of 10 from 3 against the Miami Heat because Domantas Sabonis wasn't in the bubble and he couldn't play out of handoffs. And oh yeah, he got played off the floor by the Boston Celtics because he couldn't do anything against the switch and they were targeting him defensively. It was kind of easy to see that, like, he's probably not going to have a playoff role. And yet, like, if I squint my eyes, I can see versions of, like, Jarace isn't fully ready, and I understand why he wasn't playing, but, like, down the road, I can at least envision him having a use against the Boston Celtics in a playoff series, if that makes sense. So it's like minutes that could have gone to Jarace ended up going to Doug, and I understand why they did, but it's like, would it have potentially played at least some dividends if you could have thrown Jarace out there just to be like, hey, look, here's somebody with a 7-foot wingspan who might feasibly be able to switch in some instances where Doug cannot.
Did you know that 40% of Doug McDermott's career playoff games happened in the last 2 months? That could have been related to what you were just telling me.
Yeah, and in the Bucks series, like, being able to throw him out there and have him have the degree of readiness where he can be like, hey, I can immediately come in off the bench and knock down a 3 against the zone, and now Milwaukee's not going to play more zone. I think that was helpful in certain circumstances, but, like, he clearly was not going to be a regular part of a playoff rotation.
Shot better from 3 in the playoffs in the regular season, which actually kind of mattered sometimes. All right. What have we done, both stat and clip or just clips?
We did both.
Okay.
We can go to the over-under, which is, we've kind of been on the same track for all 3 guys today. It's actually just 0.5 games for the Pacers next season.
Wow.
He's still on this roster.
I thought if I had McDermott, my number would have been 0.5, but it would have been roster spots used on Doug McDermott instead of games played.
Exactly.
There is kind of merit to it, I suppose. Like, a veteran shooter is not the worst thing to keep, but I mean, let me ask you a question in response. Would you offer more than the minimum?
I would not bring him back.
Yeah, I
like Doug McDermott, the player. I just don't think, for the reasons that I laid out, that he's necessarily a great fit for this roster, despite the fact that he was a very good fit for the way that Rick Carlisle prefers to play. And I made a video about that in terms of him just being able to play very easily in flow game and move for that bench and what he did for the Mavericks that season. I just think that if your movement shooter isn't necessarily accentuating the strengths of your ball handler and also has defensive deficiencies, I would just more so lean towards just playing Ben Shepherd in those minutes. And hopefully Jarace carves out a role if I needed additional depth.
And if you wanted to, like, there's 2 options. If they wanted to either add a free agent externally or use pick 36, because that's not going to be a 2-way. It's going to require a roster spot. Who's gone? The two most natural options are Doug and James Johnson. And it feels like they really like James Johnson and having him around, that it would be Doug that they would carve out that spot for. And I do think there's merit, given that, I don't know exactly when this will happen, if it'll even happen at all, but, like, if they're going to make another trade for a great player, it's going to be a player trade, not a pick trade, because they already did some of their pick trading to get Pascal. And so if they trade a lot of young players in that deal, using 36 and maybe getting someone who could help you in the future actually is smart and beneficial. And they've done well in the top end of the second round, although this draft supposedly stinks. I have admittedly done no draft prep work this year. Or if they want to figure out what they can get on a BAE or minimum kind of thing, like, can you do better or find a better fit than McDermott, even if it's somebody who's not going to play for you? Maybe. So I feel like that's the most natural roster spot for that. So I would also take the under, although I will say, at least if they signed him back, I would get it. Like, it wouldn't be what I would do, but I'd be like, okay, I get it.
I would be less so on that front.
To me, if you're going to sign a guy who's not going to play, a specialist type of player makes the most sense, right? Like, and he is certainly that. But I would not play him over any of their top 11 or 12 next year.
Yeah.
With that in mind. This has been a segment about the Kings. The Kings should sign Doug McDermott because he'd play with Sabonis and they could use some shooting. So, fittingly, another bridge between the Pacers and Kings, just what the world needed. This was good. This was great. This is what everybody can expect from our many other episodes that we have not planned out yet, but will feature 10 other Pacers players. And if we find the fun time, maybe we'll do some other stuff on coaching in front office and all that kind of stuff. Did you have fun, Kaylin? Did we get through everything you hoped we would today?
I did. It was thrilling. Just to provide people with an update, I wanted to do these videos over here and collaborate with Tony on Locked On Pacers. I will be embedding these videos on my site. And then in addition to that, with the clips that we each picked, I'm writing extended blurbs on each player and what those clips mean for their future. So if you do head over there, it will be unlocked for everyone. You can read, you can watch this along with it and follow along. So if you prefer to read, there'll be something to read. If you prefer to watch, there'll be something to watch. So it's a win-win.
I wish I could just throw clips on this. Unfortunately,
let me tell you, I was throwing a lot of clips on the YouTube shows I was doing during the playoffs, and those were a lot of work to produce. I can let you know that.
Yeah, what's copyright? Whatever, we'll be fine. Next one of these will be next week, probably at some point. Caitlin and I haven't discussed that yet, so Caitlin, don't frown and tell me that I'm wrong for saying that right now. But there'll be four more of these at some point, diving into all these players. Hope you guys enjoyed this one. Take care. We'll both see you very soon.